Hi, I've prepared some absolute giants for you today and some smaller games too. So if you're into 2002 Windows gaming, grab a drink and let's do it. Wow, that sounded so much better in my head. Akuji the Demon is a side-view action-adventure fantasy platformer of the Metroidvania kind. So you know, fun one. It's also an answer to the age-old question: will it come back and bite you in the ass? What do I mean by that? Well, you know those games, those RPGs, the action-adventure ones and whatnot, those in which you have to overcome obstacles and gather strength on a long road to Heart of the Evil to defeat it, and then, when you finally get there, you never really kill it. Just lock it off somewhere in something like a crystal, some kind of an artifact, or even deep bottomless dungeon. Akuji the Demon answers that question precisely, because it tells a tale of the evil that was once defeated and now comes back to take its revenge on those who wronged it. And yes, you're guessing right, you're the evil. So Akuji that you're playing as was once evil, terrible, despicable demon that terrorized the land and kept people living there in a constant state of fear. He's been used as means to keep children in line and as a cautionary tale for all those who want to venture into less traveled, more dangerous areas against common sense. Anyway, so you're him, and you've been defeated by a hero, some hero, unknown hero, never mind hero, some time ago and sealed in a dungeon. What's more, your absolutely huge and near limitless powers have been taken away from you and split into 9 magical orbs and scattered around the dungeon you're locked in. Which is just the most stupid thing ever. I mean, if you don't want to hide them all around the world, take them to the next village, to the nearby forest, or just drop them in the lake somewhere. But don't leave them where you've locked the demon. It's just too silly. Anyway, your task is naturally to break out of the dungeon and lay justice, or well, injustice, to all those you've been wronged by. And you'll do it in a platforming fashion, going through the maze-like dungeon, seeking magic balls containing your powers, mana stones to raise your max HP, and jalapeno peppers because they're tasty. Well, they're spicy and restore your HP, but it doesn't really take away from them being yummy. The enemies are incredibly varied and more cute than scary if I'm to be honest, and the bosses are big, and appropriately so, but not too difficult to put down, and the areas you travel through are detailed and interestingly designed, so you won't get bored playing Akuji. It looks as if it should release on SNES and plays like that too. But it's a Windows exclusive and a pretty darn good one at that, so all fans of action platformers and Metroidvania games should definitely give it a try. Oh man, I'm gonna get some hate for that, but Warlords Battlecry II is totally unnecessary. The original turn-based strategy Warlords games were something of a novelty when they dropped and quite fun in a hot seat multiplayer environment. They offered a lot of races, interesting scenarios and some easily downloadable mods that prolonged their life considerably. Well, Heroes of Might and Magic games kinda killed them, but that's beside the point. Battlecry games were released as an answer to the change in the video gaming trends and remade to be real-time strategies. Which, you know, is understandable, but also kinda too little and too late. By 2002, when the second Battlecry dropped, the market was oversaturated by dozens of releases in the genre, and many of them were considerably better than it. And I'm not just saying it because I'm not a fan of RTSs, I'm saying it because I feel it's a fact. Feel free to prove me wrong though. Anyway, the game features 12 different races, each with their own units and resource requirements, which means that playing as each of them, or against them for that matter too, requires different tactics. It may seem like a lot of potential replayability, especially that the campaign can be played with either of them, but they're not well balanced at all, and it's a bit superficial as nothing about the campaign changes when you try out different races. It's always same and static and doesn't follow any kind of an overarching story, but rather focuses on conquering of the world of Etheria in series of approximately 60 individual skirmishes, which for some may be fun, but for me just is. And I have a lot of games that just are, and will never really be played. So yeah. The research tree and hero development are both nice touches, and you can tell that there was some idea behind it all, but other than that, Battlecry II just feels lacking, at least compared to its direct competitors. But if you've played everything that there was in the genre around the same time, or you're some kind of an amateur RTS historian, then yeah, by all means, give it a go. It's not a bad game, it's just not great. Star Trek Starfleet Command is the third game in its own series, and same as its predecessors, it features campaigns for all playable factions, so Federation, Klingon and Romulan, and they're focused on the similar time period and theme of Federation and Klingon alliance building a new joint advanced starbase Unity 1 near the Romulan border. And it's shown from all 3 different perspectives and expecting you to behave and act like the particular factions that you're playing as. Since the game tackles the Romulan unrest times, when the Federation and Klingon are in alliance, it's not difficult to guess that the game is set in the next generation period, so the one that most of us fans of Star Trek consider to be the quote-unquote best. Or is it just me? I mean, I can't be the only one to feel that way. Anyway, the third game brought some serious changes, aiming to simplify and streamline gameplay. But whether it was a good decision or not, I'll leave up to you. Transporter bombs, electronic warfare and seeking weapons are entirely gone, weapon overloading is too, and energy allocation is minimized not to dilute the tactical strategy side of the game. You cannot control a squadron of 3 ships like you could in previous games anymore, but a single aircraft only. But since these are more or less faithful to the TV series, short of changes required by the balancing, it's not too big of an issue. What did we get in return though, you may wonder? Quite a lot actually, but if it's enough to justify the changes, it's very personal and down to each gamer to decide for themselves. By far, the biggest addition and the only one worth more than a passing sentence is the customizability, meaning that you can upgrade or downgrade ship's components to prepare it for particular tactical challenges ahead or just to raise its overall firepower or speed. So you can add, remove and change weapons, engines, warp core, thrusters and anything else, really making each of those ships special and one of a kind. It's definitely a fun change and one that many RTS fans would appreciate. Well, at least these who prefer the personal touch to Zerg swarms in their games. Another interesting addition is the targeting of particular parts of the enemy ships. So core when you want to reduce their power, engines when you want them to slow down or even stop, and so on. Aside from traditional online play, Starfleet Command 3 used so-called Dynaverse 3, which allows it to hold a persistent universe for it online, where even up to 128 players can partake in battles competing to conquer the galaxy. It's perhaps not the first thing that you'll do when grabbing the game, but it's definitely something to contribute to its longevity. So if you're a fan of RTS or Star Trek, I'm sure you'll find a way to enjoy Starfleet Command 3 one way or another, but if you're not, it is highly unlikely that it will grab your interest. You may like or dislike GTA games, but their importance in the history of gaming is unquestionable. And GTA 3, other than the very first, is arguably the most important of them all. It is based on the same as always concept of following a criminal climbing the ranks of the underworld and making the name for himself. GTA 3, however, was given an incomparably more immersive, full 3D treatment and third-person view camera to complement it. While a large part of the game, same as in the earlier entries, is spent in different cars, either on a mission, en route to it or running away from cops among others, the entire game world is explorable on foot too, and many of the tasks you'll need to perform will require you to do so outside of your fave car. The Tri-City setup from before is gone too, and the game is entirely set in the Liberty City that is loosely based on the NYC. Grand Theft Auto 3 is entirely story-driven, so while there are numerous extra side activities, the main loop revolves around completing the game's plot that is composed out of dozens of interconnected missions. And this, along with countless improvements in presentation, made it an instant hit and a title that kickstarted Rockstar's fame. As with each next entry, they've improved in storytelling, presentation, gameplay mechanics and features. GTA 3 may not be the best of their games, but it sure as hell is in the top 3 most important. Next to the second Red Dead Redemption and either first or fifth GTA, depending which you consider to be the most influential. The one that started it all, or the one that took it online and made it a multi-billion-dollar business. The point of it all is that Grand Theft Auto 3 is hella fun. You run around completing missions, both main and side ones, spreading death and destruction all around, using a variety of weapons and causing millions worth of damage in the city with little to no care for the consequences. All in the name of fun. One could say that it's gratuitous, pointless and silly violence and nothing more, but then one would be wrong. Sure, the violence is there and omnipresent, but it's there to complement the story and not to serve as a base for it. All you do outside of the missions, however, be it killing anything and anyone on your screen or just driving a cab for chump change, is on you and on you alone. So yeah, think about that. Claude and Catalina are the modern Bonnie and Clyde, a law-breaking couple that's as daring as they were in love. Or at least that's what Claude thought so. Because when they arrived in Liberty City and were robbing a bank, you know, as one does, Catalina and her Colombian friend/secret lover Miguel betrayed Claude, shot him and left him on the crime scene as a scapegoat. And that's a dick move if I ever saw one. Awaiting transport to jail, Claude recovers from his physical and mental wounds. As he's being moved a little while later, the prison van is ambushed by the Colombian gang, who's there to recover another inmate riding with Claude, his prison buddy, 8-Ball, whose name has nothing to do with drugs or the game, but rather his pre-existing condition, causing him to have 8 of what most men have only 2 of. From then on onwards, free again, Claude seeks jobs from local mob bosses, rising through the ranks and plotting to take his revenge on Catalina. Industry Giant 2 is a sequel to the 1997's first game and a real-time business simulation, and as the title stipulates, it's about managing your own company. from resource extraction, through manufacturing, to transports and sales, and everything in between. All of it. And it's actually pretty well done. It may perhaps not beat Capitalism 2 at the company running part, or Transport Tycoon Deluxe at how it handles its transport, but it's the only one that does both, so at least in that, it's unbeatable. Now, despite how I might have made it sound with such a short description and general summary, Industry Giant 2 is anything but simple, and keeping control of everything requires a keen mind. I mean, sure, it's easy to start and fail, but succeeding, even in virtual world, takes patience and practice. The idea here is that simple. Take whatever the little cash you're starting with and turn it into a huge money printing business. Something Scrooge McDuck could put in his vault and then dive in it. The best, but not necessarily easiest way to do it is to identify what the market may need and then fill that niche. Doing so, however, and with a profit may take time and smart investments, so failing a couple of times should not detract you from trying, because all of those missed attempts will add up to the experience that then you can later on use to succeed. And if you don't want to do it on your own, figure out all the do's, don'ts and maybes. The tutorials included are actually pretty good and lay basics of the gameplay in a simple and easily digestible way. As the time goes by and the years pass, more and more things will change in the world of Industry Giant 2, new products to research, manufacture and sell, and new customer needs. It will be ever-growing and evolving gameplay loop that will keep on giving. Well, until it won't. Because same as with most other similar games, you eventually, after countless games under your belt, hit that point where you've seen it all and when the routine settles in. And when that happens, fun moves out, packing its bag and seeking shelter with another title. To be clear, it will be a long while before it happens. But rest assured, it will happen eventually, as such is the nature of business simulations. Talking about business simulations, Trailer Park Tycoon is one too. And it's another one from Germany, so you can expect two things: quality design and fun gameplay. It's also one that banked on the humorous side of management spectrum, so it's designed not only to offer a decent simulation backbone, but also attractive to the eye and soul flesh. Well, it has to be noted that many of the jokes in these humorous business simulations are downright cringe, or based on stereotypes, so while it's entertaining to a certain degree, it's not a very sophisticated humor. And this game is no different. Anyway, as the title no doubt have given it away, you're managing a trailer park in this one. And you can either play it in Tycoon mode, which is a continuous chain of missions with different increasing in difficulty objectives, or in a free play mode, which is basically your sandbox in which you can play Trailer Park Tycoon endlessly without any overarching goals, constraints or limitations. And while I would advise starting with the earlier, it's the latter that in my mind is the most fun. There are 4 kinds of residents you want to attract to your park: trashy, flashy, cool and old school. And to do so, you'll need to place certain kinds of trailers, amenities and attractions that they would find the most appealing. Each of the objects has a rating that adds points to appeal for particular 1 or 2 of these kinds of residents, and mixing and matching them to cover as many needs and wants of your tenants as possible is a key to success. Objects can only be placed in pre-assigned locations, which is a bit odd and limiting. And the fact that there are only 4 teams of country, swamplands, desert and urban available really change nothing in regard to the fact that Trailer Park Tycoon in a lot of ways feels like a mobile game. It's simple in its gameplay and design, with very limited progression and features. It's as far from Industry Giant 2 content-wise as it's possible. It's not trash, mind you, I've not changed my mind about it, it's just average and has that very uncanny and unmistakable scent of mobile title, which is not everyone's cup of tea. Battlefield 1942 is the first of a now 14-title spanning series that upon its initial release broke the internet. Well, at least the corner of it that was all into online shooters, and especially war-based ones. I'm not one of them, but I too temporarily got lured in and gave this massive wargame a try. While Battlefield's setting is based on World War II, certain creative freedoms were taken for the sake of balancing, which, in a competitive shooter, even one where up to 64 players can battle it out at once, is kinda important. The maps of Battlefield are different from those found in other Pew Pew Pewers, as rather than being small contained areas, there were these gigantic landmasses of which you were fighting against the opposing forces on foot, using over 20 authentic for the time and conflict weapons, or in one of over 30 different land, water and air vehicles. And it was that scope of more, bigger, higher and better that made Battlefield 1942 so addicting. Because DICE did not settle for the easiest route to make their game and instead aimed to break all the records, allowing for more players to battle it out at once than in any other commercially successful and popular shooter, serving much larger maps, wider selection of weapons and stupidly large number of vehicles. Did the game needed all that? Of course it didn't, but having them in made it a lot more interesting and fun to play, as the variety that it offered allowed for countless possible tactical scenarios to play out organically and not feel orchestrated or scripted. The game maps are set in South Pacific, North Africa, Eastern and Western Europe, and comprise of the typical for the genre versions of game modes of conquest and domination kinds mostly. The difference in available classes and the limitations that they have promote teamwork and cooperation, which makes all the combat clashes in Battlefield 1942 not only more action-packed, but also realistic. Which I suppose is what FPS gamers really wanted at the time, as it became a near instant hit. The only real downside of it all, if you can even call it that, as it was just not designed that way, is the lack of any real single-player mode. So love it or hate it, the importance of Battlefield 1942 in the history of gaming is unquestionable. Command & Conquer Renegade, unlike all the other games in its series, is not a real-time strategy, but a first-person shooter. I know, that's unheard of, Command & Conquer's good name desecrated with such an unfitting genre. Only not really. Because while it most definitely is not an RTS, and there's no going around it, it's actually not terrible, and as an FPS, it works quite well too. The game is set in 1995, so during the first fictional Tiberian conflict, and places you in the shoes of one of the GDI's commandos, so the very basic units in any of the earlier games, and sends you against the node. Well, you get a gun and the rest of your gear too, it's not only pants, shoes and the courage that you're armed with. If you're a fan of the series, it's interesting to see the conflict through the eyes of the most basic grunt, as opposed to the general leading the entire armies. Anyway, you're playing as Nick Havoc Parker, and your mission is to cut your way through the enemy forces straight into the Node Brotherhood Heart of Command and free the 3 Tiberium research specialists that they've kidnapped. And while that's your main task to complete, the game is entirely mission-driven, and each of the missions has primary, secondary and often tertiary objectives too. Which may sound a bit overwhelming, but actually adds a lot to the replayability. It's worth pointing out that the plot that you'll be following in the game is nearly one-to-one retelling of the one from original first game, just from a different, more personal perspective. If you've played any of the earlier Command & Conquer games, the enemies that you encounter in Renegade will be all easily recognizable and something you're quite familiar with. Which naturally means that there will be quite a few vehicles too. And some of them you can actually control. It's nothing new in the genre perhaps, we've just spoke about Battlefield after all, but it's definitely a nice touch and fun factor adding flavor. And since we're on the nice touches, some of the enemy groups have officers with them, and these should be eliminated first as they can actually call for backups, and you really don't want that. Especially that in Renegade you'll hardly ever get a breather and will spend most of your time actively fighting off Node. It's not serious sum, mind you, the number of enemies is not something a regular person could never handle, but it's still a lot, and they will try to keep you busy, piling up all around you as you cut them down like weeds. Since Renegade's presentation is rather stellar, both in terms of visuals and sound, and the action is fast and frantic, there's seemingly nothing to pick on here, right? Well, there isn't if you're normal, but I'm me, and I'm not. So I have to note that it's really short. And while it's nothing dramatic, it's not a 2-hour game after all, but it's also not something that we'll be investing a week into. 8ish hours sounds about right though, maybe 9 if you're adventurous and taking in the sights, but not much more. And there are actually sights there worth a look or two. While I'm much more into arcade car racing, MotoGP Ultimate Racing Technology is completely correct about 2 words from its title. It is, in fact, 2002's ultimate racing game, at least when talking about motorcycles. It features 5 game modes of training, quick race, time trials, arcade championship and Grand Prix, and while most are self-explanatory, it's the last one that's the quote-unquote main career mode of play. It features renowned riders from nearly a couple of dozen of countries from 2001 season, and they are all fully licensed, meaning that they come with their bikes and their stats are more or less describing them how they performed in real life that year too. Driving physics are probably better than what you've seen in other racing games to date. Though that's not necessarily a perk if you suck at these races same way I do, and if you do, I suggest sticking to the lower end of the difficulty level slider. There are 10 official tracks from the 2001 MotoGP included, and they're all perfectly represented in the digital format. Well, as much as the 2002 stack allowed for. The dynamic weather effects are a nice touch too and influence both visual presentation and how the bikes handle. And that's pretty much it when it comes to the technicalities, I'm afraid. And while not a lot, it's definitely not nothing, given that it's just a racer. The career mode is rather fun and it starts with naming your rider and assigning him 10 attribute points to cornering, braking, top speed and acceleration. And as you progress through the game, you'll be awarded additional points in numbers depending on how well you did in Grand Prix races. There may be only 4 of these attributes perhaps, but even as simple mechanic as it is, it adds a lot to the longevity, as you may want to complete the game more than once, trying out different quote-unquote builds. While MotoGP may not be the GOAT motorcycle racer ever, it's definitely up there with the best for the first half of the decade. I initially planned on saying here that every video has got to have a star game. You know, a title that's so much better, or more important, or more something than the others, and that for this one, it's Divinity. That was the plan, because despite it being the last game in what you're watching now, in the drafting stage it was one of the first few. And since I've already spoken about GTA 3 and Battlefield, it's not really viable anymore to consider it more anything, now is it? I mean, it's still a great title, just not one to stand against these two giants. Oh well, let's carry on as if this entire segment was not there at all. So Divinity is a top-down angled perspective role-playing game that's kind of a bridge between Diablo and Baldur's Gate. It sits somewhere in between the two, serving its own small niche of gamers. Its combat is action-based and point-and-clickety, and the item drops are randomized, so that is borrowed from Blizzard's classic. All the quests, static handmade locations, NPCs and deep multiple-choices dialogues come from BioWare. It takes a bit from Bethesda too, as most items that you'll ever find in the game world, even if they're totally unusable and pointless to have, you can actually pick up and carry. Even chairs. Yep, you can run around with your own collection of chairs. In case you ever have to start a spontaneous game of musical chairs, even if none of the NPCs would ever take part in it. So, yeah, it's a game of many things borrowed, but also one that feels like its own thing. There are 3 classes that you can play as: Warrior, Wizard, and I shit you not, Survivor. So you know, long-forgotten Destiny's Child's third member, other than Beyoncé and Kelly Rowland. And all of these classes have 4 unique specializations, offering different skills, spells and abilities. Overall, while being the first title in the soon-to-be long series culminated with the 2 original Sin games years later, and eventually Baldur's Gate 3 too, this one's pretty sweet and definitely worth replaying, even today in 2025. I bet that you thought that I forgot to tell you about the story. I didn't. A divine order is sworn to protect the lands of Rivellon from all evil, and they're doing a pretty darn good job at that. Well, at least they have. Cause as it turns out, the evil is nigh, and it begins to resurface slowly here and there as greed, corruption and violence. You play as a hero who wakes up in the town of Healers, with all of his/her memories gone. You're physically okay, but your past is a jumbled mess. Since the town is in need of help, however, they beg you to find a cure for the leader, and you agree and embark on this mission, unknowingly stepping on the path that will lead you to a confrontation with higher powers, and eventually even grant quest to unite the mythical Council of Seven. 7 powerful mages that 2000 years prior sacrificed themselves to save Rivellon. What a start. So if you wanna know more, you gotta give Divinity a chance. So what do you think? Cool games, right? Wanna try some? Did you play any? How's the weather where you're now? And where is it? These and many other questions can only be answered below in the ever-welcoming comments section. If you like this video, make sure to mash on that like down there too, and hit the bell and sub if you're there already, as there's no better way of making sure that YouTube won't forget to let you know when I release something new. I'm done for tonight though, so take care of yourself, eat great food, see the sights and live your life. Oh, and play games, because that's fun too.